Dr. Alan Karbelnig, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you on the show. You were recommended to me by Michael Gellert, another psychoanalyst who's been on the show 2 or 3 times. And so I'm delighted to have you. And you are both a psychologist and psychoanalyst. So maybe you can get us started a bit here by telling us a bit about your professional journey. How did you get here with all these credentials and so
on? Great question. And I have to do the 4-minute or 3-minute answer because it's a long and torturous story.
Yeah, that's fine. We've got plenty of time.
Okay, so the very beginning is I come from a family of physicians. My father was an orthopedic surgeon. In fact, he had a good life till 89. Last week, on November 8th, he would have been 100. He was born in 1923.
Oh, my goodness.
His father was a gynecologist, obstetrician. And in my sophomore year of college, I took a survey of philosophy course, and I fell in love with philosophy. I was a pre-med my first year. I remember having lunch with him. Was I going to disappoint him and so on? He said no. He wanted me to be a professional of some type, of course, with our Jewish background. And so that began my journey into psychology. Undergrad, the UC Santa Cruz, UCLA, and then graduate school, USC. I immediately began working for a forensic psychiatry clinic where I was very well paid. That's where I cut my teeth in forensic work, which is still part of my work, but more less and less. And at that clinic for 4 years and at the next clinic for 4 years, both of those psychiatrists were psychoanalysts. They got me interested in the work. At that point, professionally, I was doing psychotherapy and forensic evaluations. But starting in the 1990s, I went into psychoanalytic training at a place now known as the New Center for Psychoanalysis. That's a very intensive 4-year program. I got a second PhD doing that. And then since then, I've been in practice in South Pasadena, the last 8 years in Old Town Pasadena, where I do mostly psychoanalytic psychotherapy, couples therapy, little tad of forensic psychology.
Yeah, how did you end up in Pasadena? I know it for the Rose Parade and the Johnny Carson show. They used to talk about it a lot. But how did you end up there?
So I love that question because I was reared in the Inglewood area and then West LA. I don't think I had ever been east of the 110 freeway in my life. But that second 4-year stint that I mentioned in a different psychiatry practice was in Pasadena. And it was really a good job. It launched me into my private practice in 1989. But I'm telling you, David, I had no knowledge at all of Pasadena. My wife of 41 years, which is, some kind of a record, like I think Gavin Newsom should send me a certificate or something, or better yet, a check. My wife was born in Glendale, wandered around a bit. We've now owned a home in Glendale for 35 years because that's just a 10-minute drive to Pasadena. So the short answer to your question is it was work. Work that got here.
Yeah. Interesting that and I grew up actually in, and I think I'm older than you are, but I grew up in Southwest LA.
Okay.
You mentioned Inglewood. I was actually, I don't know if you were where you were in the infamous LA riots. But
Go ahead. I can tell you a story about that.
I actually grew up near the heart of that. I wasn't there. I had already been away I was eager to go to school elsewhere, and was lucky enough to get into the University of Pennsylvania,
Oh,
and
wow.
that was a big transition.
So,
So yeah, your story about the riots.
so we lived in Ladera Heights. Do you know where that is?
I don't.
Because very few people do. It's near Culver City, and it's nested north and south of Slauson Avenue.
Okay.
So I used to go with my dad when he was on call on the weekends, all the way down Slauson to Huntington Park, all the way back. At one point during those riots, right on Slauson on the south side of the street was a machine gun nest with
Oh my God.
a army guy, and I'd never seen a big, huge machine gun like that. It was really frightening. I think most of the rioting was south of Slauson, but that's the closest I got. And we have to do something about income inequality, but that's a totally different interview.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hung out a lot at the southern beaches, Manhattan Beach and Redondo Beach, and so
Yeah.
on, and that was um, uh, that's the best part of my LA experience that I recall.
hmm
Uh, um, so I have a copy of your forthcoming book,
hmm
Lover, Exorcist, Critic, Understanding Depth Psychotherapy, and I must say it's a real tour de force.
hmm
Uh, I think it's destined to be a classic. I wish it had been around when I was a graduate student in clinical psychology at the University of Michigan, which I've had occasion to talk about on the show before. A very psychoanalytic program, and I did not take well to that program. There was nobody that I wanted to grow up to be
hmm
among the faculty, so I was a little bit of a rebel. Now, come full circle in many ways, because I I think that it gives the most complete sort of picture of personality dynamics. So after having looked into all kinds of new age therapies and so on, and I did have a private practice before I went into university teaching for many years. So
hmm
so that's a bit of my relationship to it. So that's why I would have loved your book, because it's personal.
hmm
You engage in self disclosure, which
hmm
is really important to me as a psychologist and as a reader, and I'm always really interested in the dynamics of the author, where they're coming from. So
hmm
I love your passion and energy, and the picture that you sent, which will be in our show notes. And you said, "This is my handsome picture." You said somewhat self-mockingly,
uh,
but your picture actually reminded me of Norman Mailer. I don't know if you ever saw him.
I, I read several of his books.
Okay,
I
yeah,
saw a picture of him. Uh, I, I'm flattered by that, and I'm extremely flattered by the way you've received my book and described it. It was a 10-year project,
I
David,
can believe it. I can believe
yeah,
it.
and I, like you, have always missed out. I loved how you said when you were studying psychoanalytic ideas, you didn't have any professors at the time that you could kind of identify with.
Right.
I remember having the same feeling, and you rarely see a book or an article where a psychoanalyst talks about errors they made. And this book contains a couple of serious errors.
Right.
No boundary violations, I say defensively, but definitely boundary crossings. And I also explained the psychodynamics of why. And you just don't see that anywhere because, understandably, people don't want to say mistakes they made.
Right. And people are rewarded and promoted for there's even in terms of the research and so on, for
Uh-huh.
positive results. And
Yes.
They don't want to hear that much about the other. There are some other good examples out there. There are other psychodynamic writers who I've also been able to say to them, boy, I wish your book was around, because they really get into the how-to. They even provide you sometimes with concrete scripts that, of course, you can't literally follow, but give you a sense of direction. So none of that was around when I was in school, and it was sorely missing. So what led you to write this book?
So
this 10-year tour de force.
It was probably more than 10 years, because I started and stopped, started and stopped. When I was I was in psychoanalytic training between 1990 and 1994. I can't believe how long ago that is. That's scary. A couple things bothered me right from the beginning. One was they would advertise scientific meetings, and that was a throwback to the so-called modern era, when science was king, which many people like me believe ended in April 1912 with the sinking of the Titanic, which was supposed to be the perfectly engineered, unsinkable vehicle.
Right.
And the other thing that bothered me from the get-go was, why are there all these different theorists that are fighting with one another? As you probably know, psychoanalytic institutes have literally split over theoretical differences.
Yeah, and much of it struck me as the old saw about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Exactly. And from the very beginning, and I put this in a paper, but the editors quickly deleted it. Freud and Jung were buddies about as long as the Beatles were together.
Okay.
And so to me, it was another shame that, like right here, I have the Freud-Jung letters, which I've actually read a number of them. It's like reading love notes that are followed by a breakup.
Yeah.
And so then you have this also separation of Freudian from Jungian institutes that's been going on for 100 years. So I developed 3 metaphors that I believe work across all psychoanalytic disciplines, theories. And I had a paper published in February 2022 in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, where I introduced basically Lover, Exorcist, Critic, I introduced as framing, presence, and engagement, which, if you want, we can get into the distinction later. But I chose Lover, Exorcist, Critic because I wanted it to apply to a large audience, psychoanalysts, patients, the lay public, and also I wanted to make sure to encapsulate, whether you're Jungian, Freudian, or Kleinian, relational, those metaphors work.
Yeah, and I love the fact that in the book you actually go through the psychoanalytic evolution, the history of psychoanalysis, starting with Freud and moving through most of the major figures, and each of whom had a school associated with their name, not necessarily a physical school, but a school of thought, and like Bion and Klein and Melanie Klein and others. And so I was thinking about where, if you were to look at your psychoanalytic heritage, the field is still young enough that people up until very recently, and maybe still, could say, well, I was analyzed by so-and-so who was analyzed by so-and-so who was analyzed by Jung or analyzed by Freud. Do you have a sense of your lineage that you can share with us?
I have a very clear sense of my theoretical leanings. I don't have that kind of heritage. Well, let's see, I don't know who my first psychoanalyst in the 1990s, who was not particularly helpful to me, by the way. I do not know who analyzed him, who analyzed that guy.
Yeah.
I had 2 years of very helpful supervision from a guy named Jim Grotstein. Have you heard of him, David? Jim
What?
Grotstein, well-known guy, died a few years ago.
Say his name again.
Jim Grotstein.
I don't
G-R-O-T.
recognize it off the top, but
Right, so he had been analyzed by Bion, who had been analyzed by Melanie Klein. So I have a
okay.
little bit of that lineage,
Yeah.
but not through my psychoanalysis, through my own my own clinical supervision.
Yeah. Sometimes
Annoys me, by the way. That stuff really annoys me because it sounds so cult like.
yeah.
You know,
It,
I have been practicing Lutheranism since Martin Luther attacked his proclamation on that door. You know, it's too inflexible.
yeah. Um, and you did you mentioned the Jungian Freudian split, and one of the things that I liked as I sort of consider myself a Jungian fellow traveler, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and because so much of the Jungian approach appeals to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm free to pick and choose what I like in the theory and leave out the part that I'm not so much into. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, but I think you really already covered it. I was going to ask you that you've attended a lot of psychoanalytic institutes, and they seem to me like they were either Freudian or neo-Freudian in their orientation. But I have the impression that you're quite open to the Jungian approach. Did you ever consider becoming a Jungian analyst?
By the time I knew what that was, I had already been masochistic enough in terms of getting 2 PhDs. I've always been interested in the law, and I considered law school actually, but my wife threatened to divorce me if I did that. And then my joke was, of course, well, at least I could manage my own divorce then. I have attended a number of lectures at the Jungian Institute. Like you, I really like a lot of Jungian ideas. And 3 very interesting facts. One is, as I mentioned, I had 4 years of psychotherapy with a Jungian analyst, Michael Gellert. I'm currently consulting a Jungian analyst, Sidney Roth, and I have a Jungian analyst as my own patient, which was very strange because on the first session I said to him or her, you know that I'm not a Jungian. I understand archetypes and complexes a little bit. And this person said, no, this person actually had an existential concern. And my first PhD was in humanistic existential psychology.
Yeah.
So that's why this person wanted to see me. So how strange that on my own journey of my personal work, the last 20 years, not the entire time, but have been with Jungian. So yeah, many good ideas. Can I say one more quick thing?
Yeah.
That paper I'm so proud of that was published in Feb 2022, where I introduced a standard model across all theories. Robert Wallerstein, who died searching for a grand unified theory, he came up with this phrase, you can use the psychoanalytic opus for its theoretical metaphors. So to adhere to the standard model, I prefer that you use those models as theoretical metaphors, but frankly, the standard model will work even if you're a hardcore Jungian, Freudian, or Kleinian.
Yeah. And I think there's research and you mentioned in your book, although you don't cite the research, but there is research that suggests that the different people of the different analytic schools they like to talk a different theoretical perspective, but what they actually do tends to be more similar than not.
Yes, I think that's super interesting. The one I remember is people fresh out of graduate school or training practice very differently. 10 or 15 years in, they practice very similarly.
Yes,
And in
yes.
my view, it all depends on the patient. If I have a patient coming in and he's full of envious anger, I'm going to think about Kleinian metaphors. If a woman comes in who is very interested in mythology and tells me her dreams every session, I'm going to be thinking about Jungian metaphors, so on and so forth.
Sure, sure. Now, I loved your personal origin story.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, of you first as an angry, defiant young boy whose parents finally dragged him to a kindly psychoanalyst. And that sort of set the pattern for your life. But tell us, and this is partly how I came up with thinking that you reminded me of Norman Mailer, who
Mm-hmm.
was famously a very pugnacious interviewee.
Mm-hmm.
And which thankfully I'm not finding you to be a pugnacious interviewee. But tell us about this. It's a great story. Tell us the story of how your parents dragged you to a psychoanalyst, what you were doing, and then how and where that's still in your personality.
So I'm afraid this is turning into a psychotherapy session with me as patient, and I willingly go there.
Okay, great.
You have my full consent. So like so many psychotherapists, I had a very difficult mother, bless her heart. I am entirely responsible for her now. She's 95 years old. I'm what's called the successor trustee. But my cousin, in fact, called her a monster. And it was, I would say, if this is before the child reporting laws, but if those were in effect, it would have been reported. She was angry or rejecting 100% of the time. I was kind of the sickly kid, and she would come into my room and say, if you're sick tomorrow, I'm not going to feed you. I'm not going to bring you fluids. I'm not going to take care of you. And I could tell you so many vignettes about her, but I don't want to diss her because I understand it's all about the images in my mind now. It's not about
right. Right.
But where I came to the psychoanalyst is after 0 to 9, let's say, being a rejected, frightened boy, rather suddenly at around age 9, I erupted in anger at her. And I was so angry at her that my father had to work to separate us. So, like, that's where on the weekends he would take me to his office Saturday and Sunday so I wouldn't be around her. And I remember so clearly sitting on Slauson Boulevard in my dad's Lincoln Continental, like a big box, good orthopedic surgeon car, and saying, honest to God, David, how could you have married her? I said. And this was the beginning of what Michael Geller called very helpfully for me my second abandonment, because my dad was really a pretty good dad, very good. I would wait for the garage door to open for him to come home, and it was no question that he loved me, and I would say he saved me from falling into a psychosis. But around age 9, I think my father faced this terrible decision where all the kids were having problems. I was one of 4. I was number 2. And I really think, and there I am saying, how could you have married her? That he chose her over us. He died about 9 years ago. I thought about him so much last week when he would have turned 100. So him, I have much more mixed feelings about, a lot of love and care. And with my mother, I feel a combination of compassion and residual anger. But to specifically answer your question, I know it was about at 9. they took me to this guy at UCLA. Actually, I think his name was Ritvo. I think that was his last name. And he gave me the Rorschach, which many years later I became an expert in myself, quote unquote, an expert. An expert is someone with a briefcase and a plane ticket, in my opinion.
Right.
This guy was very nice. I remember his office clearly. And, I forget what I wrote in the book in detail, but I know that he told my parents I was very angry, and my mother delivered that to me like it was my problem out of context.
Yeah, and you were
Um,
acting out in school. That was one of the things that grabbed my attention was
mhm.
you were starting to get into fights at school.
I got into some fights. I was never good at fights. I
Yeah,
remember changing a kid's bicycle lock so he couldn't unlock his bicycle. I was sent to the principal for that. Oh, and there's something else in the book. I was basically acting out my anger. And I love this idea for any of you that are not very steeped in psychoanalytic ideas. The whole idea of acting out is that the feeling is converted into an action so clearly that the emotion vanishes. So when you ask the 9-year-old, this almost happened to me actually with my friend Larry Wagner. We lit a paint can on fire near the school, and it started to spread, and we frantically put it out with dirt. But for example, had we burned down part of the school, and someone said, "Well, were you angry?" The answer would have been, "No, I don't remember being angry. I just wanted to burn something down." See what I mean?
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I was like a rowdy kid, and even though I started pre-med in college, I would say my journey of the soul really began with my troubled childhood, some early psychotherapy I had in my freshman year of college, that also started to turn my life's work, if you will, into being a different kind of doctor, a doctor of the soul.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the title of your book, which refers to lover, exorcist, and critic. You mentioned that. How do these apply to or illuminate depth psychotherapy?
So let me take them one at a time, David, so I don't
Yeah.
talk too much. And I watch these people on TV pause for sound bites, and I'm trying to do that. So let's start with lover, because exorcist is complicated, critic is not. Lover started as prostitute, by the way, and I got a lot of pushback from that. I'm
I
still
bet you
getting,
did.
yeah,
But
I'm still,
people have said, hey, this is like, you're paying for friendship. You're paying for, so
yeah,
it's only a small step to prostitute.
exactly right. And I get pushback from lover as well, but I'm very clear in the book. Um, and psychotherapy should not be rent a friend. Probably half of it is, but that's not what it should be. And the lover came about once I let go of the prostitute. Um, what I call in my academic work presence is basically when the patient walks in, whether they have anger, acute grief, they're about to get divorced, the whole array of problems, you bring or you should bring your attention that is only found, in my opinion, in the first 6 or 12 weeks of a romantic relationship. Now, very clearly, no sex, no aggression, no touching, no hitting. Those two ends you never want to do. But the analogy is that whether you're Freudian, Jungian, Kleinian, relational, it doesn't matter. Your job in those first 5 or 10 minutes of a first session with someone is to give them rapt, RAPT attention,
Right.
care, curiosity, respect. That's what the lover metaphor means.
Yeah. And that's such a gift because it's rare enough in our world, other than in special friendships, I would say.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
And
tell us a little bit about the Exorcist and the Critic. I mean, I think I understand them, but I want our audience to understand them.
I want to add one thing about the lover, though, because I used to do forensic psychology and employment law and administrative law. The only part I do now is administrative law, specifically for psychotherapists. And I've been involved in a number of sex with psychotherapist cases. And if you think about it, because I really want to make sure to put these boundaries on the lover metaphor,
Right.
there's so many female patients we all have, that it's the most intimate relationship in their life. So you have to be very careful about boundaries because you're the only one you're talking to. Okay, Exorcist. Exorcist is the most difficult. And in the book, I use a lot of examples from the patient Carlos, who's based on a real person, uh, massively fictionalized. But the Exorcist involves the function of the psychoanalytic practitioner taking possession of projections from the patient. So I'll give you a brief example of a medical doctor who was my patient only about 2 years ago, serious personality problems, personality disorder level. His practice was in trouble. He was in trouble with the medical board. Staff would leave a week after he hired them and so on. He did the typical thing where in the first few months of twice a week psychoanalytic psychotherapy, he would tell me I was spectacular. I was the best psychologist in the state of California. This, of course, felt great to me. Within a few weeks, I had fallen from the pedestal so badly, David.
Right.
Honest to God, he would stand in my exit door with his hand on the threshold, his finger pointing at me. We did call each other by our first names. Alan, you are so incompetent that when I leave today, you need to call a consultant and get help with your clinical work. You have no idea what you're doing. So I would take possession of that fury of his. Hey, the first couple times my inside voice was, fuck you, man. How I'm insulted. But the inside voice quickly quieted down. I never acted it out, except maybe in small ways, like ending sessions early or something. And you basically digest that information, just like you digest the idealization, and you give it back to the patient to ingest. That's how the Exorcist works. And I borrow my buddy Ronald Fairburn, who literally uses it in one of his papers. He talks about the psychotherapist is the true successor to the Exorcist. I cite that passage several times because I think it's quite accurate. That's one of the things that causes burnout too, by the way. You don't want to have too many access to patients because it's very difficult on your body mind to take in these projections, process them, and re-deliver them. Pause now for the soundbite.
Yeah.
David,
Yeah.
did that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Because that's the one that, like people that aren't psychoanalysts, even some of them have really asked me, I don't get that. I don't get what you mean. So it takes kind of a lengthy explanation.
Well, I think many patients present the feeling that, in fact, they are possessed by some, the symptoms feel like an alien presence.
Yes.
And I can imagine that it's useful to actually buy into that metaphor for a while if that's something that they can latch on to and helps them to live with it.
Yeah, I've never really thought of this before, but I haven't really seen any dissociative identity disorder patients, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. But I've evaluated several of them when I was doing forensic work. And it would be very useful with them because usually at least one of their alters is a kind of a horrible, critical evil being. And yeah, I agree with what you said, David.
Yeah. Also, I think with people that are suicidal, that it can be useful to just say, yeah, there's somebody inside you that wants to do you in,
mhm,
and you need to separate yourself from that.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in some ways,
And
you take possession. I think a highly suicidal patient could be another example of the Exorcist, where through your role as the lover, being very attuned to them and really feeling their pain, I think it takes some away from them. And in some ways, you contain the hope. You hold the hope that they're not able to hold on to.
yeah.
And that can be helpful as you deliver it back to them.
Yes. Yes. And then the critic. I don't think you've said anything about the critic.
I haven't, and the critic is the simplest. I remember having some struggles even thinking that chapter long enough. Um, if you think about literary criticism, or let's say you had a group of people, I just read a New York Times article where some groups, and I think it was 25 years reading Finnegan's Wake, which I've never read. I did read Ulysses, however, by James Joyce, where you might get together and critique a novel. I would say every person's life is like a novel. And a chunk of what we do as depth psychotherapists is critique their lives. Like, oh, Joe, we've been meeting for a year now, twice a week. And I noticed that in that time, you've been in 3 relationships with really rejecting women. And then they end the relationship. Gee, I wonder if there could be some kind of pattern there.
Yeah.
Yeah, David, it's almost common sense in a way. A part of what we do is critique patients' lives, whatever their recurrent problematic patterns are. We critique them in this safe, structured environment. That's the critic.
I think the art of that is to, if possible, to be able to put it out there as, I'm curious about this, I noticed this, but without them feeling, quotes, criticized. But it's inevitable that at some point they are going to feel criticized, and then that's something you got to work through.
Now, in my view, that's the most eloquent thing that's been said during this entire interview. And you, my friend, said it because right on, like, let's go back to that medical doctor guy. It would be months later that I would deliver to him the connection between these swings with me and the problems he's having retaining his own office staff, nurses, etc. That would be a critique, if you will. But the whole art is like timing, not giving them more than they can take at any one time, observing if they're feeling criticized, like when they get defensive. That's the dance of the work. And you couldn't have said it better, because in some ways, all psychotherapy is a critique, working, as you said, not for the patient to feel criticized. I remember one of my very first supervisors, like literally 40 years ago, saying, psychotherapy is the art of telling people they have bad breath in a way that they don't find in any way offensive or critical. Whoa, what a
Whoa,
challenge.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a tough one right there. This is a huge topic, but the role of the unconscious in depth psychotherapy. I mean, it's really, and there's a way in which it's all about the unconscious, but let's have you talk about the unconscious.
Well, first of all, for the lay people watching, there's nothing really mysterious about it. Oh, good, I get a plug. I write a weekly newsletter called Journeys to the Unconscious Mind. And if anybody shoots me an email and it takes, because of my last name, it's a cinch to find me online, I will send you a free subscription. And I just wrote a piece last week, actually, where I discovered even cognitive scientists, neuropsychologists agree 99% of our brain is unconscious. Consciousness is something like 20 bits a second in processing. The unconscious is at least 1,000,000. Now, some of that is our organs functioning, maintenance of temperature control,
Right. Yeah.
all kinds of things we don't want to think about or need to think about. There's a smaller piece that psychoanalysis calls the dynamic unconscious,
Unconscious. Right.
which is where the really the meat and heart of our work is. It's what distinguishes psychoanalysis from any of the other forms of psychotherapy. And it's the idea, let's just go back to the guy that tends to choose rejecting women. And now I've seen him do it 3 times over a 1-year period. That would be an example of what, I hate to say the word, but Jung would agree, what Freud called, the word I didn't want to say was Freud, the repetition compulsion, which I call psychocognitive behavioral recurrent patterns, is all they are. We all have them.
Yeah.
If they're not unconscious, we would be changing them. And that's what psychoanalysis is all about. Nothing mysterious about it. A lot of it is childhood patterns that we observed or were part of that were so painful, we rendered them unconscious because we couldn't bear having them conscious. And the work of all different psychoanalytic practitioners is bringing that stuff into consciousness.
Right. Right. And I liked, I wanted to ask you about the goal of psychotherapy, and actually you write it of not psychotherapy, but of depth psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
You summarize it in the book with one word. Do you
Oh,
remember
really?
what the word was?
I don't. I don't.
Freedom. Freedom.
Oh, yes. And I stand by that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. How do I go about answering that? So the psychoanalytic psychotherapies have done a terrible job of branding themselves, and it's really a shame. And I hate that word branding. And I hate that now that I finally got a book published, I have to market it and go on Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff that I
And be on podcasts.
be on podcasts. Yeah, I'm going to be on one for the International Psychoanalytic next month.
Okay.
By a guy named Harvey Schwartz. I don't know him. Have you heard of him?
No.
Anyway, so the problem is people think the word psychoanalysis, which I think should be used to describe once a week, twice a week. It doesn't have to be 4 or 5 times a week. Let's see, in a nutshell, I'm going to get to freedom in a second here. Depth psychotherapy is where you look at childhood patterns, current relational patterns, meaning present day, and the relationship between psychotherapist and patient. You're basically looking in those 3 realms for where there's consistent patterns that reveal the unconscious mind. Very essentially, these psychocognitive behavioral patterns. And kind of a very recent riff of mine, David, when someone comes to see me and they've never been in therapy before, is, well, we're gonna be doing 2 things. We're gonna relieve the suffering you have because of XYZ, and then by taking a really intense look at you, we're going to help you to be a more authentic person, which also increases your freedom and autonomy. That little riff turns out to be not so little, but just the last part, which is probably 20 seconds, is literally what I deliver. I started with a new guy on Friday. When I see him again this week, I'll give him the riff. We didn't have time. There's too many other explosions in his life, I'm afraid. So
Yeah. We're living in a very anxiety arousing time.
Yeah.
But I don't need to tell you that. But it's undebatable. And so, what perspectives or solutions or comforts does the depth perspective provide?
Great question. So yes, our time is a perilous one because of climate change. We have two hot wars right now, one in the Middle East, one in Eastern Europe. Nobody really talks about the thousands of nuclear warheads pointing at each other, that a
Right.
simple human error could create unbelievable devastation. It's dark. It's dark. I have daughters in their 30s. I was young in the Vietnam War, but I was very active in the anti-war movement. I've told them many times this is 100 times worse than then, and things looked bad then. So what psychoanalytic psychotherapy can offer is that second part of my riff. By reducing suffering, that was part one, helping people find their kind of true, authentic selves, they're not only going to learn to treat themselves better, but they're going to learn to treat others better. And I believe it's going to empower them to take some kind of political action. Lots of philosophers like Michel Foucault have said there's no such thing as being not political. We are all political animals. So I think Aristotle said the same thing. So by helping people become more of who they really are, I think it empowers them to help change these terrible things that are happening in the world. I have a lot of hope about that.
One of the things that psychoanalysis is often criticized for is the expense of it. And I noticed in your bio that you are or were involved with a is it a free clinic or to reach out to people who can't afford?
Yes, let's see. So May 1 will be 20 years. So 20 years ago, May 1 in 2004. And this really came out of my own guilt at my fees were getting pretty high. And as if I had a single mom with 3 kids that was depressed and could afford $20 for psychotherapy, I didn't know. There was nowhere in Pasadena to refer her. So I helped to found this center called Rose City Center, that where you have pre-doc and post-doc clinicians. We now have 12 of them. That the work isn't for free, but the minimum fee is $30, and we have a scholarship program where we can see patients under that amount. In the year 2022, we did 6,500 sessions were provided to economically disadvantaged people. Since the pandemic, it's now throughout California because we can do a lot of Zoom psychotherapy. And I must say, if I drop dead tomorrow, and I hope I don't, it would absolutely be my proudest professional accomplishment, that it's a training program, but it's also a very active clinic. And finally now there's money in the bank. I'm still on the board. I teach a class there every week. And Rose City Center, any of you looking for psychotherapy and you can't afford awful capitalist exploitative rates, go to Rose City Center.
All right. And you mentioned Zoom, and I know Zoom really came into its own during the pandemic. How much of your work is on Zoom, therapeutic work?
Okay, so during the pandemic,
or phone, because
okay,
phone's also an option.
yeah. During the pandemic, I was probably 80% Zoom. I never stopped coming in. I would open a window and I had a fan on. I remember there's a guy I still see who is now 82. There's no way he would do Zoom. A lot of his pain was because he wasn't able to socialize. He's a very gregarious guy. not as much as Norman Mailer, but gregarious guy. And I prefer in person, but I would say now, because of what happened, how the whole world changed in the pandemic, I would say 30% on Zoom, 68% in person. And there's only one person that wants to be on the phone, and that's because it's a 70-year-old woman that literally doesn't want me to see her visually. But I have a 79-year-old woman who is fine seeing me on Zoom. I always leave it up to patient choice. Like, I choose my theories according to the patients, but that's how I work right now. And again, I prefer in person, but Zoom is a lot better than phone.
Yeah.
For obvious
Yeah.
reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that we haven't gotten into that you want to make sure that you get out while you're exposed like this?
Well, I would love those more scholarly interested folks to look up some of my writings. I've written a piece called The Psychoanalyst as Revolutionary. My first one was about the psychoanalyst as performance artist. I'm working on one right now called The Psychoanalyst as Prostitute. That one I'll have some trouble getting published. My weekly newsletter, David, I put a lot of work into that. It's probably like you and your show, where I never realized it would just go on and on and on. This will be the end of my third year, and it comes out every week. It's on Substack. As I mentioned, it's called Journeys to the Unconscious Mind. I offer everything from clinical vignettes to political angles, like a psychoanalysis of Donald Trump. And I take very few new patients, so I'm not really looking at that. I work half-time now and write half-time. So I think that's all that I can think of. Marriage and family.
Is there a website that's kind of like the hub of where people can find out about you and your work?
Well,
and your writings?
I have a new website just about to be launched. I had a patient tell me it was tired looking, which I was a little bit hurt by, but it is at least 20 years old. So yeah, and it's just alankarbelnig.com, and that has links to all my scholarly articles and to the weekly newsletter. And David, maybe to this podcast. I don't know if you maintain the copyright to it or if you allow other people to have
I do.
I'll certainly have a link to your show.
Yeah,
So,
I'll send you the material that you can put on your website.
oh, that'd be great.
Why don't you spell your name for people so they have that? Because Alan can be spelled many ways, not to mention your last name.
My last name, man, I've been spelling, it's probably been 5 million times since first grade. So the first name is Alan, Alan. Last name is Karbelnig, Kar, B as in boy, El, N as in Nancy, IG. And my email address is just amkarbelnig@gmail.com.
Okay, so people can reach out to you. Well, doctor and psychoanalyst Alan Karbelnig, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
And I want to thank you so much, David, for being such a kind and thoughtful interviewer, and for giving me the opportunity to share some of my ideas.